Putting on. All right. So this is programming CSS. Hi, I'm Terry Ryan from Adobe. That's who I am. I want to know who you guys are. So who here sees themselves as more as a web designer? Okay, who's more of a web developer? Great. Great. How many people here absolutely love CSS and can't wait to do more of it? Okay, how many people now hate me for having even asked that question in that manner? Okay. All right, how many people don't like CSS? Because people that seemed reluctant to say they hate me because you clearly don't know me yet. No? Okay. How many people here are using some preprocessor already? Okay. How many people here don't see the value in a preprocessor? Okay. How many people here interested but haven't really played with it yet? And who here said preprocessor what? Okay, that's fair. No, that's fair. I'm trying to keep it light, but it's fine. Then one last question. No, I think that scratches it off. And luckily, I now can make fun of designers because there's very few designers in the room. All right, great. So first, I want to go over some kind of important ideas as we go and talk about everything I'm going to say here. The first idea being that, I don't know, about 10 or 15 years ago, some really smart people got together and told us, using the web, said things like, don't use tables for layout, use CSS. Tables are for tabular data. They're just one of the tools in your toolkit. And that was great, and that was very true, and that's what you should have done. Except that's not what we heard. What got repeated was, don't use tables. Tables are for tools. Use CSS. And so you ended up with code like this, where you had divs with the classes for table cell and table row, and I think I did at least 3 of these apps before I got slapped around by people for what are you doing? And so the reason I point that out, the reason I bring this up is because I'm going to say words like avoid. And it means consider other options before using, not never, ever, ever do this ever, ever, right? So this will make this clear that these are, when I start talking about these are best practices and these are things you should do, and avoid, not never use, because clearly there's a reason it's there in the spec. It's not like everything is blink, right? Like there are reasons why these things exist. And likewise, prefer means, try to look at this to solve your problems first, not always do this. The second thing is that you may be shocked, but CSS is not a programming language. And that has a lot of implications. It's sort of self-evident, but it has a lot of implications. One being that there's a whole bunch of stuff missing that we're used to from development environments, things like variables, things like loops, things like functions. And so as a result, we end up writing often very unproductive CSS code. We end up repeating ourselves, we end up repeating ourselves, we end up doing the same thing over and over again. And as someone that comes from a development background, it's maddening about CSS. But it's not a programming language, it's a descriptive language, it's a style sheet language. The second thing is that there are 2 ways you can sort of approach CSS, right? One is to optimize your CSS for fellow human beings that are going to read your CSS at some point, right? But that ends up, the optimal way to write CSS in this way is to break it up in a whole bunch of different files that have different meanings, just like we do, break up things into classes and whatnot, and you end up with many browser inefficient style sheets. So, okay, you should optimize for the browser, in which case you end up with one really long, hard to read CSS file. So the net result here is when you do just base CSS, you're going to end up with bad CSS for someone. And so that's part of the problem. So these are all important concepts I want to get out in the open. And how do we solve these problems going forward, and how do we deal with them sort of for the rest of our time programming in CSS? So first thing here, who here uses a CSS reset? Okay, who here hates CSS resets? And who here doesn't know? Okay, cool. All right. So a CSS reset. I'm going to skip here's the demo. I'm not going to bother rendering it in the browser because this is a really dull page. But here is the demo page for one of the resets. And all of this code is nothing but HTML, nothing but H1s and Ps, and like there's no style at all. And this was rendered in Chrome. The actual screenshot was rendered about a year ago. So it was when Chrome was still on WebKit. And here it is in Safari. It's the same exact thing, right? It looks exactly the same, except if we look at it, rendered side by side, we'll see that there's some weird line thing going on that's driving the Chrome version down by the end of the page. They're not lining up. And let's keep in mind that these are both running WebKit, right? These are, in theory, they should be exactly the same, and they're not. But it's not like they're drastically different where you can clearly see them. They're just subtly different. So browsers render things different. So there's a couple fixes for this. You can do browser-specific hacks when you find them, which can be very maddening. You can just deal with the differences, say, like, I don't care about pixel-perfect design, and then your designer will scream at you because that, we haven't been able to convince them that pixel-perfect design is not a good thing yet. And then finally, you can do a CSS reset, where basically you set everything to 0. You start every property, you get everything so that if you type an H1 and a P right underneath each other, they'll look exactly the same. There's no padding, there's no style, there's no nothing. There are a couple, there's some good things and some bad things about this. So the good thing is that it forces you to consider everything. Everything within your design is now prescribed by you. If you wanted H1s to be huge, then you set H1s to be bigger than everything else. What ends up happening, though, is that you'll set up your page and it'll run through some sort of CMS, or content is coming dynamically because that's the way things are, and someone will have put like an address tag, and now everything else is styled, but you didn't think to style the address tag, so now that one piece looks like crap. So it's really good to do this, but you have to keep in mind that you will have to now consider every single part of your design completely. I don't do this for every project. When I do bigger projects that are kind of important to me, I do resets. But for just a small little thing here or there, I tend not to do resets. That's resets. Next is organization. Actually, I'm going to skip organization, and I'm going to go to this one. I love this. Class versus ID. Does anyone here know when you use a class in CSS and when you use an ID in CSS? No? It's a trick question. You never use IDs, ever. Ever. That is the sort of reaction you will get if you ask certain people about this. You can still use IDs in HTML and JavaScript, okay? You absolutely can use them in HTML and JavaScript, and you should use them. They have an important meaning and they have important value. But you should avoid using them in CSS. And the reason why is CSS specificity, right? And in order to make something that could be incredibly dry and boring a little more exciting, I'm going to borrow from Andy Clark, who did this thing called CSS Specificity Wars to kind of explain why you want to not use IDs. So, when you apply a CSS class to an element, that element is sort of like a stormtrooper. He can push people around. His style's kind of, he maintains the style that he wants, and he kind of enforces that. However, when a class shows up, we know who's boss, right? So classes beat elements, just like Darth Vader would beat a stormtrooper. And then an ID is the boss of a class, right? I know in the movie, obviously the Emperor was defeated by Darth Vader, and that's maybe a little weakness in this. But we gotta know, like, he can shoot lightning out of his hands. Come on, he should have been able to beat Vader, right? So IDs will beat classes, which will beat elements. So how does this work out? So imagine I've got a div, and I've got a background image set on class div, or I'm sorry, on element div. That's going to render this, okay? If it comes along and I've assigned an element tag, so I've got on the element it's troop, but on the class is Darth Vader, well, Darth Vader is going to win out. And then finally, when I've got an ID and a class and an element CSS declaration that apply to all of these, the ID will win. Well, there we go. The emperor wins. So, and actually, I'll go a little bit further because the metaphor can be extended because, come on, I'm showing Legos here. This is great. Inline will actually beat ID. So I have all of that applied, but I add an inline style. It's sort of like the Death Star, right? It's going to blow away the emperor. And then finally, there's important, which, again, if I do everything and I apply important to it, it's like Batman, right? And the idea here being that no matter if it makes sense or not, whenever the writers of the universe in which all these people are contained get together, they've decided that Batman wins. Even if it doesn't make any sense, Batman wins. And that's sort of how important works. So why is this important? Why do you need to know this specificity? Because you will see code like this, where I say, header P's, the color is red, but in panel P, color is green, which one wins? So you guys should know which one wins here, right? What color will it be? Red. Okay, good. You were paying attention. Good, I've got you. But most likely, these bits of code will be very far from each other. And you'll be working on panel and not being able to figure out why panel is turning up red instead of green. Now, granted, you can use inspector and get to it, but then you've got to find it. And so it causes problems, it causes issues, it causes maintainability problems. So that's why the recommendation is to avoid styling based on IDs, because it's so much more powerful. It just overwhelms any class declaration, and a lot of times you won't know why you've gotten there. So recap, an element will be defeated by a class, which will be defeated by an ID, which will be defeated by an inline style, which will in turn be defeated by important. Any questions about that before I move forward? No? Okay. All right. Next thing is avoiding CSS smells. You guys are familiar with what like code smell is, right? Yeah? It's an idea that it works, but you don't feel too good about it afterwards. So what are some CSS code smells that we can avoid that are getting better with our CSS? One is avoid what we call magic numbers. Right? If I look at that code up there, I basically am saying all the LIs in this are styled one way, but you know what? The last one, just make 3 pixels down from the top, which says to me something went wrong in your design. You're trying to figure out why this isn't going where it's supposed to go, and you've just kind of cheated and added 3 pixels to it. So this is pretty brittle, right? If something is causing this problem and you eventually fix it, you've now got this weird thing hanging off this 3 pixels that you've added that you might not know why. And then someone else comes to your code, they look at it and they're like, why is this 3 pixels? I don't know, I'm not touching it. So now you've got all this code that, you know, someone doesn't want to touch because you've added a magic number. Avoid, not never, avoid qualified selectors. So here I've got li.phoneNumber color red. The problem there is that this will only apply to phone numbers that are specifically in LIs, right? Well, if phone numbers are only going to be in LIs, it seems sort of ridiculous that I wouldn't maybe put it somewhere in a text, maybe somewhere in the body of a paragraph tag. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't put it in a span. But I've said no. Only phone numbers that are in LIs will look this way. So you reduce the reusability, and you're making more work for the browser. Now, are you making a tremendous amount of work for the browser? No, but eventually these things add up. So why do it? Just say .class phone number, and then you can reuse that phone number class elsewhere where it makes sense. So next is avoid undoing CSS, right? So I go through and I apply text shadows to all H2s. And then I go, whoa, except this one. This one, don't do that. Odds are if you've done that, it's because you've applied your class too early. You've made a decision to apply a CSS style too high up in the hierarchy of the page. So you're better off applying it where it makes sense than to set all H2s to be this way. It's less maintainable, right? It's kind of the corollary to this is avoid super broad laws, avoid super broad rules, like this one. Basically, everything in the body, add a text shadow to. This is a colossal mistake, and if you ever see someone do this, add text, just stop them around, because this is bad, right? It's the same sort of thing. You've applied it too soon. You've applied it to, it's less maintainable, and someone won't expect, why is this? And if you start to try to go through on the inspector and try to find where it is, it can be kind of hard to figure out why this rule is applied, because it's applied all the way to the body, because no one ever does that, right? So, as I said before, prefer classes to IDs. My perhaps overreaction when I set that rule to you the first time was, prefer it. There is the occasional place where you're going to need to target based on an ID, and that's fine, but in general, prefer them. Avoid using important to fix bad CSS. So somewhere along the line, I really wanted that code, that panel P to be green, and I couldn't figure out that it was because I messed up and used an ID, and so I set it to important. Don't do that. That's not what important is for. What important is for is when it's actually important. I've got an error message, and I want to make sure that no matter what I'm doing in style, if there's an error on something, that the color red wins out, because it's important that your errors be red, be bold, and be different. So that's one place where important makes sense. And obviously, these are going to be judgment calls on your part, like what is important, what is not important. That's fine. But make sure you use important for things that are actually important. Prefer specific class names. And this is something, you guys are all developers. I don't know, or most of you are developers, so I don't think I have to go too deep in this. But obviously, you want to do card instead of, sorry, you want to do credit card instead of card, because card is too generic. Odds are you will only have, credit card will be a limited case in your design, and most likely you see credit card, you know exactly where that is on your design. Whereas if you just say card, well, is that the user card? Is that the credit card? Is that something else? So keep them specific. All right. Next thing is object-oriented CSS. Before I go on, any questions about code smells? No? All right. All right, the next topic is object-oriented CSS. How many people here have heard of object-oriented CSS? How many people here have played around with it? How many people here really like it? Okay, good. I will not irritate anybody with my conclusions. Okay, so object-oriented CSS is exactly, we take two buzzwords from two different places, stick them together, and come up with something. Object-oriented CSS basically means two things. There's two major principles behind it. One is remove the skin from the structure. So here's how everything's laid out. Here's all the colors and fonts. Pull them away from each other. And the next is remove content from container. Well, that one I have to kind of show to explain. So skin from structure. So here I've got two pieces of interface. I've got a comment and I've got a tweet. So I'm showing comments on a blog post, and on the side I also have tweets about it. And if we look, they're very similar, right? They have the same font, the same background, and the same border, just their font size is different. So what object-oriented CSS would tell me to do is pull out the things that are the same into a kind of a bigger class name for them, in which case a remark, and then put the difference in the two pieces, comment and tweet, so that things would be both a remark and a comment, and a remark and a tweet when you code it in CSS. The next bit of this is container from content, right? So I've got footer H2. I bump up the font size and change the color to red. What object-oriented CSS would tell you is, like, don't target the element, don't target parts of the ID. Give that a specific name, secondary header, so that you can now reuse that style in multiple places. If, yes, it's how it looks in the footer, but actually I'm using the same exact look and feel on a header somewhere else, let's just call them secondary level headers and be done with it. So that's it. So the question is should you do this? Okay? And I think there's a lot of value here. I think looking at object-oriented CSS and looking at that idea of, well, let's extract stuff into common classes and let's not be so focused on the layout and design pieces and let's give things names so they can be reused. I think those are great concepts. And so I would challenge you to take a look at object-oriented CSS and give it a try. But I have never actually personally have ever been able to get object-oriented, like to get it pure object-oriented CSS into a project. Stuff always creeps in and it never really works for me. That being said, where this was developed is for incredibly large projects with thousands and thousands of pages, multiple, hundreds of templates, where this sort of stuff, when you get that many templates and that many different configurations, you're going to get giant CSS that if you do start to do this sort of stuff, or you pull stuff into classes and pull it out, you get smaller CSS and faster rendering because you're parsing less CSS. But depending on the size of your projects, this may or may not make sense for you. That's object-oriented CSS. Any questions before I move on? No? Okay. All right. Now I get to preprocessors. This will probably take me the longest bit of this. So who here uses a preprocessor? I asked this before. Okay. Who here doesn't use a preprocessor? Okay. Who here doesn't even know what I'm talking about? Okay. All right. So preprocessors. The theory behind them is pretty basic. I've got something that is not CSS. I run it through a process, and out spits CSS on the other side. Why would you do that? Because preprocessors all do, to varying degrees and varying syntaxes, the same things. They allow you to use variables in CSS. They allow you to do nesting. So I can have everything that's related to the header under the header and kind of all keep it all together and organized. I can do, they're not quite functions, they're called mixins because they're not functions, but they're a way of reusing the same code over and over again. They also do concatenation. I've got multiple, I want to organize my stuff into multiple files, put them different places, put my fonts one place, put my colors one place, and then it'll bring them all into one file and put them together. The result is, as a developer, as someone approaching CSS from a programmatic standpoint, you will be a lot more productive because you can use things like variables and loops and variables and nesting and functions. So let's talk about what are the most popular preprocessors. Well, it's basically Stylus, Less, and Sass. There are a couple others here or there, but these seem to be the ones that are the leaders, and pretty much that's the things that evoke strong opinions from people. What is the difference between all of them? So the difference all comes down to syntax and underlying technology, what actually is powering them. So here's the syntax for Stylus. You'll see that, let's see, setting a variable, I just at the top set it to a color, and then I can use that color as I go through to sort of, alert color is here, and then it's being called here. And that's going to render, when I get to the CSS, it's going to render this. Okay, and that's the CSS that comes out of that. If I do less, slightly different, I have an @ sign for my variables. And a lot of these, some stuff is optional. They pretty much, for the most part, will follow CSS rules, but will allow you to like omit semicolons and that sort of thing. So that's some less syntax, and that's what comes out exactly the same thing. Sass, there's two versions of Sass. There's Sass files, SASS files. Syntax is like this. You'll see it's handled with no semicolons and no having a bracket or anything. You get that. And then Sass SCSS files, or specified CSS files, which are basically CSS with a little bit of extra stuff plugged in for Sass syntax. So again, it all comes out the same thing. Now here, the underlying technology of all these is different. Less and Sass use JavaScript. Less and Stylus use JavaScript. Sass uses Ruby. Less can be both client and server. So if you want to just play and have the client translate from Less to CSS, there's a JavaScript library that'll do that for you. But you can also do it beforehand, which is the way you'd want to do it in production. Stylus all happens on the server last time I checked, and then Sass you pretty much do in development before you render it in the browser. At the end of this, you should be saying to yourselves, I can't really tell the difference between Sass, less, and Stylus, and that's fine. Don't worry about the syntax differences. I'm going to talk about what you can do with them. I implore you to go out and look at them yourselves and see which one is better for your purposes. I prefer Sass, which means someone in the audience is now really pissed off at me because I chose Sass over less or Stylus. It's okay. That's fine. It works for you. That's absolutely okay. But I'm gonna talk about, and I think it's more important that you use one of these than you use the one that I like. So all my examples are going to be in SCSS because I feel like that's the closest to something that if you're just familiar with CSS, you'll get. But variables are pretty straightforward. I set a variable up there. I set, highlight color equals that. And then I can reuse that variable as I go through there. And so now I don't have to type that hexadecimal string all the time. Nesting, likewise, I sit there and I basically say, post has a title, and then comment is a child of post, and comment has a title. And when I get the CSS out of it, I get that, which makes, it's sort of the way you'd want to do it, but it's kind of a pain to write. And now I can kind of organize it a little bit better this way in Sass. Next is mixin. So here I'm dealing with the fact that I have browser prefixes because browser manufacturers hate us. So I'm going to go through and instead of repeatedly having to type all of them out, I can just write one, and then this is what I'll get every time it comes out. And inheritance. So I can say I've got a customer and an employee. They're both a person. So I can write CSS that makes sense for all people, and then specifically for customers, and specifically for employees, and have them extend them. So when I get the CSS out, it comes out like this, which is really kind of interesting because it's not doing what I would think is, well, okay, you just put the stuff that's in person under customer and employee. It actually writes CSS the correct way. Let's take this rule and put them all together in CSS. What's that? Then some of the fun things I like are things like the color function. So I can say, hey, you know what, just lighten this color by 10%. So like on a hover, instead of having to figure out what the right color is to kind of highlight that, I can say lighten it 10%, and then it'll figure out what 10% lighter than that hexadecimal color code is and spit out a color for you. Likewise, you can also do math. So I can say, all right, the base size of this part is 28 pixels, and then add 4 pixels to it. In that case, you get 24 pixels, and so it'll do that for you and render that in the CSS. And finally, the importing process, I can take multiple files. So like I said, if I like having a fonts file and a color CSS file and a layout file, I can separate them all and then have Sass do the work of compiling it for me, or Stylus, or less. I'm going to do a very quick demo here. How am I doing on time? I'm doing OK on time. All right. I know I'll have to bump up the font here, so hold on. Is that readable in the back? You guys read that? Good? All right, great. For a minute, I had to translate. Does that mean you want it higher? Does that mean it's OK? OK. It means it's OK. All right. So I have some Sass here. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And what I'm going to do here, is I'm going to run Sass here from the command line. So let's see. So I'll just do the basic. And what it does is I say type Sass -w. And then say main SCSS file, set that to main CSS. And I run that, and you're going to see it's listening, right? So now I go through, and nothing's going to happen unless I just make a change. So I'll hit save, and then refresh here. And it spits out this. Okay? Pretty basic, pretty straightforward. And you'll see it, by default, it sort of nests it, so you can sort of kind of see the organization of post and comment and all that in there. But I have a couple different options this way. So I can have it do it, let's see, expanded. Sass is listening. We'll go back here and get rid of that, or add a line there. And when I reload this, interesting. Hold on a sec. What's that? Oh, you're right. I did. I changed the wrong file. Thank you. There we go. And then I go back to the main file, hit refresh. Oh, this is not running. There we go. All right, expanded. There we go. Now, this is kind of revealing one of the problems is, so I'll show over here. You'll see that it change detected, so basically I just leave it running and it detects all this stuff. And when I go back to the code, let's see, expanded, we'll see, there we go. So it expanded it all out, and now instead of being nested, it is that way. And so I can also spit it out as compacted, compressed, and I can make it just one giant blob of CSS because I don't really, I don't really want to see it. I just want the browser to handle it. So that, in a nutshell, is Sass. Now, someone might be saying, the command line, that looks terrible. That's a terrible user experience, and I hate the command line. Which is cool. There are a bunch of apps you can pull down that'll actually handle all of the processing for you instead of you having to run it from the command line. The one I personally use is CodeKit on Mac, which is perhaps my favorite bit of non-Adobe software in the world. So we don't make this. We're not associated with it at all, but I absolutely love it. It's not that expensive. I forget what it is off the top of my head, but I highly recommend it. It'll do Less or Sass or Stylus in addition to a whole bunch of JavaScript frameworks off the bat and do image compression. It's a really great tool. And that is Sass. So good, I'm ending right on time. So there are a couple conclusions I have all this, and I'll break for questions after this. But basically, programming in CSS is sort of no different than programming in any other language you may be approaching from if you're coming from JavaScript. Be consistent, right? Like in the beginning when you're experimenting and trying to get better with it, trying to get better with programming it, you might make different decisions here or there. But once you figure it out, be consistent. Because I think being consistent to your own code is probably the easiest way you can make sure that you're communicating with other developers properly, right? Because like I said, code is talking to two people. Code is talking to the browser, and code is talking to the other developers that are going to look at this, one of which may be you in the near future, right? So stay consistent. Once you figure out rules, once you figure out ways of writing stuff, write it the same way over and over again. Second is be deliberate. If you are doing something in CSS, make sure you're doing it for a reason. And I bring you back to the whole important thing. So don't use important because you couldn't get it to work manually. You couldn't get it to work the way you wanted it to. So you just, fine, I'll just break it and say important. That's fine. Don't do that. Be deliberate. Make sure everything you're doing because you know it works. And if you don't know why it works, I've been there. I've been that place where like I just need to get this to work. I'm not going to care about if it's perfectly coded, it's perfectly working. Don't do that. Like I know short term that seems like what you need to get done to get the project done, but figure out why stuff is rendering the way it is. So make sure all your decisions are deliberate. And then finally, be productive. I cannot say this enough. Use a preprocessor. I don't care which one you use. And I know for the longest time I fought it because I was like, come on, I know CSS. Why? As my work going out and talking for Adobe, I don't do a lot of like giant projects. So why would I need the preprocessor? And then I used the preprocessor for a little project, and I never want to go back. For a lot of times for demos, for CSS demos, I'm going to write not using a preprocessor because I'm talking about stuff in CSS, and I hate working in normal CSS without it. Because all of these things like variables, even though in theory they are eventually coming to the CSS, they're not here now, and this makes it so much more productive and makes me so much more happy working in CSS. So that's it. That's my prezzo. I'll break for questions. If you want the source or the presentation or any references to any of the stuff I talked about here, you can go to my website, terenceryan.com/thanks, and I should have all of that spelled out for you. And if you need to contact me, here's my contact information.